Well, welcome to TV3 Extra. Today, I am so excited to have author Kayleen Reusser with us again. Kayleen, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure. You are a great interviewer, and I'm thrilled to be talking about what we're going to talk about today.
Yes. Well, I thank you for the compliment. We are going to be talking about your new book. Oh, I just love this book. You have stories of about 13 women in here. It's a nice, fast read. You don't get bogged down in some unnecessary details, and I don't even know how to explain how happy I was to finish this book and to hear the stories. So
cool, great. Well, it was a pleasure. I just hold it up here. Born to be soldiers, those plucky women of World War II. If I can explain, the title came from one of the veterans. And by the way, I have interviewed all of the veterans in the book. Most of them were in person. There was one lady who lives in Washington State who, with the help of her niece, we just did that via phone. And thankfully, she had good enough hearing that we could do that at the time. But this is a quote that came to me from Ruth Licking, who is from North Carolina, but she lived in my town. And when I interviewed her, she felt like God had made her to be a soldier. And, you know, when I'm looking at her, and she was pretty slender, maybe not frail, but about 93 at the time. And it just seemed, pretty strange to hear that kind of a statement, but she still felt that patriotic. And I thought about that statement when I was coming up with the title. And then those plucky women of World War II, I've been using the word plucky for years, as soon as I started interviewing them. And I thought, well, let's just put it in the title.
No, they did. They just had this character about them. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
They were plucky. That's a good word.
They were brave. They really were bucking the system in very many ways, even though at that time the war, World War II, was demanding many men to go overseas. So they were taking them from, a lot of them would have been in administrative jobs or, just some other things. But people started saying, oh gosh, what are we going to do about those jobs? Who else can we get to fill them? And then people started saying, I think women could do it. And of course, women could do it. So that is, it was where the branches developed their own, some of them called them auxiliary arms or extensions to include women. For instance, the Army had the Women's Army Corps, or WACs. They took the initials from those words, WAC. They were WACs. The Air Force, which was then called the Army Air Corps, created a branch called the WASP, which were Women's Air Service Pilots. And, you can kind of see how that one went along with the actual fact of flying. And then the WAVES. Oh, gosh, that's a long one. I should have reviewed. Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. Very long, but again, very appropriate for their type of service, being on water. And of course, a lot of them weren't even near water for their jobs. And then the Coast Guard had the SPARS, which I think is probably, in my opinion, the most clever, because they took the Coast Guard motto, which was Semper Paratus, and that means always ready. And they took the first letters of those four words, SPAR, Semper Paratus, always ready, and made the word SPAR, though that word is also a nautical term for a piece on a boat. And I actually don't know what that is, a wooden piece of a boat. Now, the Marines were a little bit different, as most Marines would very proudly claim to be. They did not create a different acronym for their women Marines. They just called them Marines. And unfortunately, I never did find a female Marine from World War II to interview. So I do not have any in the book, but I would have loved to have done that. So, but I do have those other branches, including the Army Nurse Corps, which was different from the WACs themselves. So I could go on, but I know you've got a little list of questions. Maybe I let you go.
Well, how did you find these women?
I like I did the men that I interviewed. It was mostly word of mouth. I began interviewing around 2012, and it all came about because I had been asked by my local newspaper editor to interview a World War II veteran in our area, and I didn't know anything about World War II, but he was so patient, and he had been a Marine in the Pacific, and he was just thrilling me with his stories. And I thought, I love going to museums, but I am sitting in front of a living piece of history. And it was so amazing. So I just started looking for other World War II vets, putting the word out, and just having people tell me, oh, Dad, we can work something out here for you to visit Dad. Or, and in some cases, it was Mom. Sometimes I worked with people, or when I had a newspaper article in the paper, the editor would be helpful enough to put my email address, and then people could contact me through that. So I've got about 20 women, and these were stories here that had been in shorter form in some of my other World War II books. This was actually my 10th book about World War II. But in the other books, I was observing word count limits for each story to ensure that I had enough room for number of pages, for all of the stories. And I always hated leaving things out. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to put a book together that has all the details about these women that I found very, very interesting. And I still at times even had to leave things out. The one story about Marty Weil, where she wrote letters home from being a WASP in Sweetwater, Texas. I was just loving all of her letters. And I thought, I just can't. I could have probably put a book together just of her. But each woman, I had some women, there were 3 WASP and there were 2 in the Navy, but each one had completely different circumstances. Sometimes their parents were supportive, sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they had other people telling them they couldn't be, they shouldn't be in uniform or even in the military. So, but like I said, the military was looking for them. So they weren't breaking the law. They were actually being recruited.
And so in the book, you go through, like I said, there are about 13 women, and you literally kind of give a little background about them, what they had been up to before the war and then through their service. And it's just great. And you referenced Marty. I loved reading her letters.
Yes.
I like couldn't stop. I'm like, ooh, I gotta keep going. It's probably like midnight. I'm like, ooh, ooh. And one of her stories about kind of like a gases training. So they had to like go and I can't remember if she said smell the gas, the different gas. And she's like, we had mustard gas. And
yes. Well, and keep in mind that, and actually she is pictured here on the cover. I'm going to say her name slowly because it's a long one. Mary Anna Martin. That was her maiden name, Mary Anna Martin. And then she got the nickname of Marty when she was with the WASP, because every WASP, every male or female got a nickname. And then her married name was Weil. So she was from Southern Indiana. She attended DePauw University, and she was a science major. So she was working for Eli Lilly in Indianapolis when she read, she had read about it while she was in college. Her father would not let her quit school to go into the WASP. But then when she was at Eli Lilly, she earned enough money to pay for her flight lessons because the WASP program was a lot different than the other women's military branches. In fact, they were not ever militarized. So they were never considered veterans after the war. But they had to have 35 flight hours completed to apply to be in the WASP. And as far as I can tell from the research I've done, I don't think any of the other branches required anything like that, because the women had to pay for these flight hours. And today they're very expensive. But one of the ladies told me that she took lessons near Fort Wayne, Indiana, and it was as much as $10 an hour. Now, she was working at a factory when that happened. So, that came out of her factory wages. And I said, well, and she was single. And I said, how did you afford that? And she said, I just didn't eat much. But getting back to Marty, what I think was so interesting to her was she had a degree in science. So when she wrote these letters home, she put some details in there that, today are just so fascinating. But I'll bet her family, her father was a minister, I just don't know that they would have even known what she was talking about. I think they had to go through the same training that men had to go through. Most of our men would have been issued gas masks that were completely enclosed to be taken overseas. They would have gotten them overseas. I've had men tell me that they were that they had to be shown how to put them on and make sure they were completely sealed so that no gas would come in. And they were horrific looking things. Have you ever seen one?
Well, I think I have seen some pictures of them. Yes.
They're awful, but they had to carry those around. And the women pretty much went through the same basic training as the men. So did you have that right there in front of you? Did you want to read that?
Oh, well, I found one little letter. I wanted to read it, and you can just kind of tell her personality from these letters. And just, I love some of the words she uses. I mean, this is just a short one, but it's from September 2nd, 1944. Today was really a killer. I flew both afternoon and morning, besides an hour in the Link trainer and a 2-hour lecture about flying the civil airways in instrument weather. My total flight time was 4 hours, including a civilian check ride, which was a pushover. And I mean, there's a lot of letters, but they're not real long, so you can just get through them. And
well, she was busy, and you read an excellent example to show. I mean, they would have been tired. This was a very hot and dusty place too. So I don't know about you, but heat really just saps me. They were down at Sweetwater, Texas, at a place they called Avenger Field, which is such a great name. So all I heard about was just how dusty it was and hot. And the WASP were different too, because they were not issued uniforms. At the beginning, especially, they were given the men's flight suits. They might have even been used flight suits. But of course, these would have been men who probably were taller than many of the women. And of course, they would have had to belt them, roll the sleeves up, roll the pants up. And yet, from everything I've studied and talking to the three that I did interview, they really didn't complain. They were just so thrilled to be there. They were going to be the American military's first female pilots. So they weren't in combat. They were not even going to go overseas, but they were needed here to help tow targets. And that would have been for men who would have been, so they were towing like a banner or something behind them through the air, and men on the ground would have been doing target practice with guns, anti-aircraft fire, to try to shoot the target and not the plane. And oh my gosh, I mean, you talk about brave when these guys are brand new at this. And boy, that would have been enough for me. And then they were also taking out new planes from a factory and making sure that they worked and didn't have a bad malfunction somewhere. They were also transporting planes from one place to another, from one airbase to another, or from a factory to an airbase for a crew to pick up. So they were happy to do it, and they were paid. When I say that they weren't militarized, they were paid, but they still had to pay their room and board and for their uniforms, such as they were. And this was different because all of the other women had official uniforms. And this was something that they were proud of because they looked really smart. And I always remind people, remember, they were coming off of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And most of them would have been wearing either hand-me-downs or remade dresses, like maybe their mother had worn it and now they were wearing it, or a sister had worn it, or an aunt. They rarely got anything new. So this would have been a wonderful opportunity to look great in something new, but also to look official.